Listen carefully. This is how you destroy a woman who thinks she's untouchable. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 28 years old. And for 3 years, I was the invisible force behind Victoria Sterling's meteoric rise to Chief Marketing Officer at Meridian Communications. While she took credit for my campaign, slept with the CEO, and made my life a living hell, I was quietly building the most elaborate professional takedown in corporate history. You see, everyone thinks revenge is about anger. It's not. Real revenge? It's about precision. It's about patience. And it's about making your enemy destroy themselves while thinking they're winning. Victoria Sterling thought she had it all figured out. $1 million salary, corner office on the 47th floor, and a reputation as the marketing genius who single-handedly saved 3 Fortune 500 accounts. What she didn't know was that her brilliant assistant had been documenting everything. Every stolen idea, every fabricated report, every inappropriate relationship, every lie she told the board. And when I was done, her name didn't just trend on social media. It became a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Her downfall was so spectacular, so perfectly orchestrated that even her enemies felt sorry for her. Almost. This is the story of how I went from invisible assistant to corner office in exactly 127 days, and how Victoria Sterling went from an untouchable executive to unemployable pariah in the same time frame. Let me tell you how I did it. The humiliation catalog. The first time Victoria Sterling made me cry at work, I was 25 years old and still believed that hard work and loyalty mattered in corporate America. It was a Tuesday in March, and I just spent my entire weekend perfecting a presentation for the Hartwell Industries account, our biggest potential client. I'd researched their company history, analyzed their competitor strategies, and created what I knew was a brilliant campaign. When I handed Victoria the USB drive Monday morning, she barely looked up from her phone. "Just email it to me, Sarah, and next time, don't bother with the fancy graphics. I'll handle the creative direction." Wednesday morning, I watched from the back of the conference room as Victoria presented my campaign to the CEO, the board, and Hartwell's representatives. Word for word, slide for slide. Even the color scheme I'd agonized over. "As you can see," Victoria said, clicking to my final slide, "this integrated approach will revolutionize how Hartwell connects with their target demographic. The social media component alone should increase engagement by 300%. The room erupted in applause. James Morrison, our CEO, stood up. "Victoria, this is exactly why we promoted you. Brilliant work." I felt something die inside my chest. After the meeting, as everyone filed out congratulating Victoria, she finally looked at me. "Sarah, could you clean up in here and order lunch for the team? Nothing too expensive." That's when I started keeping records. Document everything. Every stolen idea gets a file. The Hartwell presentation was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, I watched Victoria systematically steal credit for every major project that crossed her desk. The Morrison Hotels rebranding? Mine. The cryptocurrency startup launch that won us 3 industry awards? Also mine. The crisis management strategy that saved us from the Patterson Industries scandal? You guessed it. But Victoria wasn't just a credit thief. She was a master manipulator who'd perfected the art of corporate psychological warfare. There was the time she scheduled my performance review for 6 a.m., knowing I'd taken public transportation since my car was in the shop. I arrived 7 minutes late, soaked from rain, and she spent the entire meeting discussing my chronic punctuality issues and unprofessional appearance. There was the company retreat where she introduced me to potential clients as my little helper and insisted I serve drinks while she networked. When I politely suggested I'd like to participate in the marketing discussions, she laughed. "Oh, Sarah, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're still learning." The breaking point came during the annual budget meeting in September. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive analysis of our marketing spend efficiency, real data, real insights, numbers that could save the company over $2 million annually. I was excited. This was my chance to finally step out of Victoria's shadow and show what I could do. The night before the presentation, Victoria called me into her office. "Sarah, I've been reviewing your budget analysis, and frankly, I'm concerned. Some of these projections seem optimistic. I think it would be better if I presented this to the board myself. You understand." I stood there, holding my research, my charts, my hope for recognition, and I understood perfectly. "Of course, Victoria. Whatever you think is best." She smiled, that predatory smile I'd come to know so well. "I knew you'd understand. Oh, and Sarah? Could you grab me a coffee? Light roast, oat milk, 2 sugars. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. I walked to the kitchen in a daze, made her coffee, and returned to my desk outside her office. Through the glass walls, I could see her reviewing my presentation, occasionally making notes. My presentation, my work, my future being repackaged as hers. That's when I noticed something interesting. Victoria's computer screen was angled toward the window, and the afternoon sun was creating a perfect reflection on the glass partition behind her. I could see everything she was typing, every email, every document, every password she entered. For the first time in months, I smiled. While Victoria presented my budget analysis to thunderous applause the next morning, I was in the bathroom setting up what would become my greatest asset. A secure cloud account where I would document everything. Every stolen idea got its own folder, complete with timestamps, original drafts, and evidence of my authorship. Every inappropriate comment she made got recorded and transcribed. Every expense report she fudged, every client she lied to, every meeting where she'd credit for work she didn't do. It all went into my growing digital archive. But I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was studying her. Victoria Sterling had built her career on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and strategic relationships. Her MBA from Wharton meant nothing. She'd never attended. Her successful startup exit was actually a company that folded 6 months after she left. Even her relationship with CEO James Morrison wasn't based on mutual attraction. It was pure calculation. I discovered this when I started arriving early and staying late, claiming I needed quiet time to focus. What I was really doing was accessing her computer whenever she stepped away. Victoria was careless with her passwords. She used the same one for everything. Winner 2023. Through her emails, I learned the truth about Victoria Sterling. She was broke. Despite her 6-figure salary, she was drowning in debt from her lavish lifestyle. The designer clothes, the luxury car, the penthouse apartment, it was all financed and falling apart. She was 3 months behind on her rent and had maxed out 7 credit cards. More importantly, I learned about her relationship with James Morrison. It wasn't love or even attraction. She had something on him. Photos from a company retreat 2 years ago where he'd had too much to drink and made some very poor decisions with a client's wife. Victoria had been blackmailing him ever since. But the most interesting discovery was her current project, a secret deal to sell Meridian Communications to our biggest competitor, Pinnacle Marketing Group. A deal that would make her personally wealthy while destroying the jobs of everyone else in the company, including mine. That night, I sat in my studio apartment, looking at 6 months of evidence spread across my laptop screen. Stolen presentations, fabricated reports, financial fraud, blackmail, industrial espionage. Victoria Sterling wasn't just a bad boss. She was a criminal. And I was going to destroy her, but not with a lawsuit or a complaint to HR. Those were amateur moves that she could easily deflect or counter. No, I was going to use her own tactics against her. I was going to make her think she was winning right up until the moment she lost everything. The plan I developed that night was elegant in its simplicity. Phase 1. Continue being the perfect assistant while secretly sabotaging her current projects in ways that would look like her own incompetence. Phase 2. Feed her false information that would lead her to make catastrophically bad decisions in public forums. Phase 3. Release everything at the precise moment when she'd be most vulnerable and unable to recover. I called it the Sterling Destruction Protocol. And it started the very next morning. When Victoria arrived at the office, she found her usual coffee waiting on her desk. Light roast, oat milk, 2 sugars. What she didn't know was that I'd also adjusted the temperature settings on her computer overnight. Just a few degrees. Enough to make her processor run slightly slower without causing any obvious problems. "Sarah," she called out an hour later, "my computer is being slow again. Can you call IT?" "Of course, Victoria. I'll get right on that." I called IT and reported a minor network issue that was affecting several computers on our floor. It would take them a few days to diagnose and fix. In the meantime, Victoria would be working on a slightly compromised machine, making her just a little less efficient, a little more frustrated, a little more prone to mistakes. It was a small thing, but small things add up. Over the next 2 weeks, I implemented dozens of tiny sabotages. I scheduled her meetings with 15-minute gaps that made her constantly rushed. I ordered lunch from restaurants I knew she disliked. I printed her presentations on paper that was just slightly off-white, making her materials look cheap compared to everyone else's. None of it was enough to cause real problems, but all of it together created a pattern of small failures that started to wear on her confidence. The real test came when Pinnacle Marketing Group requested a preliminary report on Meridian's client base, information Victoria needed for her secret acquisition deal. She asked me to compile a comprehensive list of all our clients, their contract values, and renewal dates. Standard assistant work. What she didn't know was that I'd been expecting this request for weeks. I gave her exactly what she asked for, a comprehensive, detailed, perfectly formatted report, with one tiny modification. I changed the renewal date on our 3 biggest accounts by exactly 1 year. Instead of showing that these clients were locked in for another 18 months, my report showed they were coming up for renewal in the next 6 months. Victoria forwarded my report to Pinnacle without reviewing it carefully. Why would she? I was just her assistant, and she trusted my work implicitly. 3 days later, Pinnacle's CEO called an emergency meeting with Victoria to discuss the urgent client retention issues that needed to be addressed before any acquisition could move forward. Victoria walked into that meeting confident and prepared to discuss terms. She walked out confused, defensive, and scrambling to understand why Pinnacle was suddenly concerned about client renewals that weren't actually happening. This is how you plant the seeds of doubt. That evening, Victoria worked late, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. From my desk outside her office, I could see her frantically checking client contracts, making phone calls, and growing increasingly agitated. Around 9 p.m., she called me over. "Sarah, I need you to double-check the Morrison Hotels tract. According to my notes, they're up for renewal in March, but I could have sworn it was next year." I pulled up the file on my computer and made a show of reviewing it carefully. According to the contract I have here, Morrison Hotels is locked in through March 2025. Would you like me to send you a copy? Her face went pale. March 2025? Are you sure? Absolutely. I can print it out if you'd like. Victoria stared at her computer screen, then at me, then back at her screen. I could see the exact moment she realized what had happened. Someone had given Pinnacle incorrect information, and that someone was either her or me. And since she would never admit to making a mistake, "Sarah," she said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. When you compiled that client report last week, did you double-check all the renewal dates?" Perfect. She was already building the narrative that would protect her reputation while throwing me under the bus. "Of course, Victoria. I always double-check everything. Would you like me to review it again?" She nodded, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was already planning how to blame me for the Pinnacle confusion while taking credit for catching the error. What Victoria didn't realize was that I'd been planning this moment for weeks. Hidden in my desk drawer was a printed copy of the original client report, the accurate one, along with email timestamps showing exactly when I'd sent it to her and when she'd forwarded it to Pinnacle. If she tried to blame me for the incorrect information, I had everything I needed to prove otherwise. But I wasn't going to use that evidence yet. This was just phase 1, planting seeds of doubt and forcing her to make defensive moves that would expose her dishonesty to others. Over the next month, I would give her 3 more opportunities to throw me under the bus. Each time, I'd be prepared with documentation that proved my innocence and her willingness to sacrifice others to protect herself. By the time I moved to phase 2, Victoria Sterling's reputation for integrity would already be cracking, and I would be the one holding the hammer. The Manipulation Masterclass. The beautiful thing about revenge is that your enemy rarely sees it coming when you're using their own weapons against them. Victoria Sterling had spent 3 years teaching me exactly how corporate manipulation worked. She just never expected me to become a better student than she was a teacher. Phase 2 of the Sterling Destruction Protocol launched on a Monday morning in November when Victoria asked me to schedule a lunch meeting with Marcus Chen, the senior VP at Hartwell Industries, our biggest client and no relation to me, despite the shared surname. Make sure you get us somewhere impressive, she instructed, not looking up from her phone. Somewhere that says success. And Sarah, make sure they validate parking. I'm not paying $20 to park just to take a meeting. Always worried about money. I was counting on that. I'd booked a table at Aurelius, the most expensive restaurant in the financial district, the kind of place where lunch for two easily runs $300, and the wait staff treats you like royalty if you look like you belong. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd called ahead and spoken to the maître d', James, whom I'd been cultivating for weeks through carefully orchestrated conversations during my coffee runs. I need a favor, I told him during my final preparation call. My boss is taking an important client to lunch on Monday. She can be difficult about money. If the subject of payment comes up, could you mention that the company account is temporarily frozen due to a billing dispute? Nothing dramatic, just a quiet word that maybe they should pay cash today. James, who had seen plenty of corporate drama, agreed immediately. Of course, Miss Chen. We'll handle it discreetly. The beauty of this setup was its simplicity. Victoria would arrive expecting to put the meal on the company card, discover there was a problem, and be forced to either pay $300 in cash she didn't have or face humiliation in front of our most important client. Either outcome would work for my purposes. Document the financial pressure points. They always crack first. I arrived at Aurelius 30 minutes early, ostensibly to confirm our reservation, but actually to brief James on exactly how the scenario should play out. Victoria's pride would never allow her to admit financial problems in front of Marcus Chen, so she'd find a way to pay. But the stress of unexpected expenses, combined with the public nature of the situation, would push her toward increasingly desperate decisions. Victoria and Marcus arrived precisely at noon. I watched from across the street as they were seated at a prime table near the window. Everything looked perfect from the outside. The call came 20 minutes later. Sarah, Victoria's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. I need you to bring me the emergency credit card from my desk drawer. Right now. Is everything okay? Hidden in my desk drawer was a printed copy of the original client report, the accurate one, along with email timestamps showing exactly when I'd sent it to her and when she'd forwarded it to Pinnacle. If she tried to blame me for the incorrect information, I had everything I needed to prove otherwise. But I wasn't going to use that evidence yet. This was just phase 1, planting seeds of doubt and forcing her to make defensive moves that would expose her dishonesty to others. Over the next month, I would give her 3 more opportunities to throw me under the bus. Each time, I'd be prepared with documentation that proved my innocence and her willingness to sacrifice others to protect herself. By the time I moved to phase 2, Victoria Sterling's reputation for integrity would already be cracking, and I would be the one holding the hammer. The manipulation masterclass. The beautiful thing about revenge is that your enemy rarely sees it coming when you're using their own weapons against them. Victoria Sterling had spent 3 years teaching me exactly how corporate manipulation worked. She just never expected me to become a better student than she was a teacher. Phase 2 of the Sterling Destruction Protocol launched on a Monday morning in November when Victoria asked me to schedule a lunch meeting with Marcus Chen, the senior VP at Hartwell Industries, our biggest client, and no relation to me, despite the shared surname. Make sure you get us somewhere impressive, she instructed, not looking up from her phone. Somewhere that says success. And Sarah? Make sure they validate parking. I'm not paying $20 to park just to take a meeting. Always worried about money. I was counting on that. I booked a table at Aurelius, the most expensive restaurant in the financial district, the kind of place where lunch for two easily runs $300, and the waitstaff treats you like royalty if you look like you belong. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd called ahead and spoken to the maitre, James, whom I'd been cultivating for weeks through carefully orchestrated conversations during my coffee runs. "I need a favor," I told him during my final preparation call. "My boss is taking an important client to lunch on Monday. She can be difficult about money. If the subject of payment comes up, could you mention that the company account is temporarily frozen due to a billing dispute? Nothing dramatic, just a quiet word that maybe they should pay cash today?" James, who had seen plenty of corporate drama, agreed immediately. "Of course, Miss Chen, we'll handle it discreetly." The beauty of this setup was its simplicity. Victoria would arrive expecting to put the meal on the company card, discover there was a problem, and be forced to either pay $300 in cash she didn't have or face humiliation in front of our most important client. Either outcome would work for my purposes. Document the financial pressure points. They always crack first. I arrived at Aurelius 30 minutes early, ostensibly to confirm our reservation, but actually to brief James on exactly how the scenario should play out. Victoria's pride would never allow her to admit financial problems in front of Marcus Chen, so she'd find a way to pay. But the stress of unexpected expenses, combined with the public nature of the situation, would push her toward increasingly desperate decisions. Victoria and Marcus arrived precisely at noon. I watched from across the street as they were seated at a prime table near the window. Everything looked perfect from the outside. The call came 20 minutes later. "Sarah," Victoria's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I need you to bring me the emergency credit card from my desk drawer. Right now." "Is everything okay?" "Just bring it. Don't ask questions." I took my time walking to the office, retrieving the card, and making my way back to Aurelius. When I arrived, Victoria was in the middle of an animated conversation with Marcus about quarterly projections, but I could see the strain around her eyes. "Thank you so much, Sarah," she said, taking the card with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're a lifesaver." What Victoria didn't know was that I'd seen her emergency credit card statement the previous week when she'd asked me to organize her desk. It was maxed out. I left the restaurant and waited. The second call came 45 minutes later. "Sarah, I need you to transfer $500 from the petty cash account to my personal checking account immediately. There's been a mix-up with the restaurant's payment system." "Victoria, I don't have access to the petty cash account. Only accounting can authorize those transfers." Silence. "Fine. Call Jennifer in accounting and tell her it's an emergency expense reimbursement. Tell her I'll have the receipts tomorrow." "Of course. I'll call right away." Instead, I called Jennifer and gave her a heads up that Victoria might be requesting an unusual transaction and that she should follow standard protocol for any expense reimbursements, including manager approval and proper documentation. Jennifer, who had never liked Victoria's cavalier attitude toward company finances, was more than happy to follow procedure to the letter. The third call came just as I was returning to my desk. "Sarah." Victoria's voice was ice-cold fury. "Why is Jennifer telling me she needs Marcus Morrison's approval for a $500 reimbursement?" "I'm not sure. Maybe because it's over the standard limit? Would you like me to try to reach Mr. Morrison?" Another long pause. I could practically hear her calculating options. "No, don't call Morrison. I'll handle this myself." That evening, Victoria worked late again. Through her glass office walls, I could see her making phone calls, checking her bank accounts, and growing increasingly agitated. Around 8 p.m., she called me in. "Sarah, I need to ask you about your background. Have you ever worked in finance?" The question caught me off guard. "Finance? No. Why do you ask?" "It's just, you seem to understand the expense reporting system very well. And you always know exactly who to call for what. It's almost like you've been studying our procedures." She was getting suspicious. "Good. Paranoid people make more mistakes. I just try to be thorough, Victoria. You've taught me that attention to detail is important." She studied my face for a long moment. "Yes, I suppose I have." The next morning, I found a note on my desk asking me to compile a report on unusual expense patterns in the marketing department over the past 6 months. Victoria was clearly looking for evidence that someone else was responsible for the financial irregularities she'd been experiencing. I spent the day creating exactly the report she wanted, a comprehensive analysis showing unusual spending patterns, irregular reimbursement requests, and questionable expense categorizations. Every single irregularity traced back to Victoria's accounts. I presented the report with perfect professional neutrality, as if I had no idea what it revealed. Victoria reviewed it for 20 minutes, her face growing paler with each page. "Sarah," she said finally, "I think there might be some errors in this data. Some of these expenses, they don't look right. Would you like me to double-check with accounting? I can have Jennifer review the source documents." No. The response was too quick, too sharp. "No, that won't be necessary. I'll review this internally first." She was trapped. The report clearly showed her financial misconduct, but asking for an external review would expose her to exactly the kind of scrutiny she couldn't afford. She had to either admit to the irregularities or find another explanation for the patterns. I gave her exactly 24 hours to decide. The next afternoon, Victoria called me into her office with what she clearly thought was a brilliant solution. "Sarah, I've been reviewing yesterday's expense report, and I think I've identified the problem. It looks like there have been some data entry errors in the system, probably dating back months. I'm going to need you to go through all of our expense records and correct any discrepancies you find." Beautiful. She was asking me to cover up her own financial fraud by framing it as data entry errors. Of course, Victoria. Should I coordinate with Jennifer in accounting? No. Let's handle this internally first, just between you and me. We don't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. I understand. When would you like this completed? By Friday. And Sarah, this needs to be our priority. Cancel my meetings if necessary. I spent the next 3 days creating 2 versions of the corrected expense reports. The first version, the one I gave to Victoria, showed all irregularities resolved and properly categorized. The second version, the one I kept for myself, documented every single original expense with detailed notes about what had been changed and why. Victoria was so relieved to see the clean report that she never questioned my methodology or asked to review the original data. She simply thanked me for my excellent work and submitted the corrected version to accounting. What she didn't realize was that by asking me to alter financial records, she had just committed a felony, and I had documented everything. The web tightens. Every desperate move creates more evidence. By December, Victoria was making increasingly erratic decisions. The financial pressure, combined with the stress of her secret Pinnacle negotiations and her growing paranoia about internal threats, was affecting her judgment. She started working longer hours, snapping at colleagues, and micromanaging projects she'd previously delegated. She questioned my work constantly, but seemed afraid to assign important tasks to anyone else. The breaking point came during the annual client holiday party. Victoria had spent weeks planning the event, seeing it as an opportunity to solidify relationships before the Pinnacle acquisition went public. She'd booked an expensive venue, hired a premium catering company, and invited every major client and industry contact. The party was scheduled for Friday, December 15th. On Wednesday the 13th, Victoria asked me to confirm all the arrangements. "I want everything perfect, Sarah. This party needs to remind everyone why Meridian is the best marketing firm in the city." I called the venue, the caterers, the bartending service, and the valet company. Everything was confirmed and ready, except for one small detail. Earlier that week, I'd called the venue's event coordinator and mentioned that our company had recently changed its legal name and banking information. Nothing dramatic, just a minor corporate restructuring. Could they please confirm the payment method for Friday's event? The coordinator, wanting to avoid any payment issues, called Victoria directly on Thursday afternoon. "Miss Sterling? This is Maria from the Grandview Ballroom. I wanted to confirm the payment information for tomorrow's event. We received a call from your office about some recent changes to your company banking details." Victoria, who knew nothing about any banking changes, was immediately suspicious. "Changes? What changes? We haven't changed any banking information." "Oh, I see. Well, your assistant mentioned that there might be some confusion with the payment processing. Should we proceed with the original credit card on file? Victoria's paranoia, already heightened by weeks of financial stress, went into overdrive. Someone in her office was making unauthorized calls about company banking information. Someone was trying to sabotage her biggest event of the year. And she was pretty sure she knew who. Friday morning, Victoria called me into her office before I'd even had my coffee. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly. Did you call the Grandview Ballroom about our banking information?" I looked genuinely confused. The Grandview? No. Why would I call them about banking? I thought everything was already set up. So you didn't mention anything about company name changes or payment issues. Victoria, I don't even have access to our banking information. I wouldn't know what changes to mention. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if I was lying. Someone from this office called them. Maria was very specific about that. Could it have been someone from accounting? Or maybe James Morrison's office? The suggestion that her boss might be monitoring her event planning sent Victoria into a new spiral of anxiety. If Morrison was having her activities watched, it meant he was suspicious about her pinnacle negotiations. "I need you to handle the final check-in with all our vendors today," she said finally. "Make sure there are no more misunderstandings about payment or arrangements." Of course. Should I call from your office so they can verify it's officially from you? Yes. Use my phone and make sure they understand that you're calling on my direct authorization. Perfect. I spent the morning making confirmation calls from Victoria's office, using her phone, establishing a clear record that all final arrangements were being made under her direct supervision and authority. When the party imploded that evening, there would be no question about who was responsible. The Grandview Ballroom event was spectacular in its failure. Not catastrophic enough to be obviously sabotaged, but problematic enough to be professionally embarrassing. The bartender arrived 2 hours late because of a scheduling confusion. The premium wine selection was replaced with house brands due to a vendor miscommunication. The elaborate dessert display collapsed because the specialized serving table was accidentally delivered to a different event. Each problem was minor and easily explained as normal event planning challenges. But taken together, they created an evening where nothing quite worked right, where our most important clients spent the night dealing with inconveniences and disappointments. Victoria spent the entire party in crisis management mode, apologizing, problem-solving, and trying to salvage relationships while maintaining a professional facade. I spent the evening circulating among the guests, quietly apologizing for the unexpected challenges and assuring everyone that this wasn't typical of Meridian's usual standards. By the end of the night, Victoria looked exhausted and defeated. But the real damage wasn't to her energy or her reputation. The real damage was to her relationship with James Morrison. Because among the disappointed guests that evening was Morrison's wife, Catherine, who had brought her sister visiting from London. Catherine had specifically requested that the evening showcase Meridian's capabilities as a potential venue coordinator for her sister's upcoming wedding. Instead, Catherine spent the night watching Victoria frantically manage one crisis after another, creating exactly the opposite impression Victoria had intended. Monday morning, Morrison called Victoria into his office for a private conversation about event management standards and attention to detail. From my desk outside his office, I could hear Victoria's voice rising as she tried to explain the various vendor failures and scheduling conflicts that had plagued the party. Morrison's response was quiet but clear. "Victoria, I trusted you to handle this event because it was important to Catherine. The fact that so many things went wrong suggests either poor planning or poor oversight. Either way, it reflects on your ability to manage major projects." When Victoria emerged from Morrison's office, her face was white with rage and fear. She walked straight to my desk. "Sarah, I need you to compile a complete post-event report. I want vendor contact information, timeline documentation, and a full accounting of every issue that occurred Friday night." "Of course." "Should I include recommendations for preventing similar issues in the future?" Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh yes, Sarah. I want very detailed recommendations, especially about communication protocols and authorization procedures. Victoria Sterling was preparing to throw me under the bus for the party disasters, which was exactly what I'd been counting on, because this time I was ready. The perfect setup. The Monday morning after the party disaster, I arrived at the office an hour early. Not because I was worried about Victoria's reaction. I'd been planning for this moment for months. I came early because I needed to plant the final pieces of evidence that would complete her destruction. While Victoria was home, probably plotting my professional demise, I was accessing her computer one last time to upload a very special file to her desktop. The file was labeled Pinnacle Score Acquisition Confidential and contained what appeared to be Victoria's personal notes about selling Meridian Communications to our biggest competitor. Details about client lists, proprietary strategies, and financial projections that would constitute corporate espionage and breach of fiduciary duty. The beautiful part? Every single piece of information in the file was real. I'd compiled it from Victoria's actual emails, phone calls, and meetings over the past 6 months. The only thing I'd fabricated was the presentation format, making it look like she'd been careless enough to save classified information with an obvious file name on her work computer. When Victoria discovered I'd betrayed her with the party planning failures, she would inevitably search through my work looking for evidence of incompetence or sabotage. The natural place to look would be my computer files and email history. But Victoria was paranoid enough that she'd also check her own systems for any security breaches or unauthorized access. That's when she'd find the Pinnacle file on her desktop, a file she'd never seen before, couldn't remember creating, and would assume I'd planted there during my supposed campaign of sabotage. The truly elegant part of this trap was that Victoria couldn't report the file to IT or security without admitting that it contained accurate information about her secret negotiations. She'd have to delete it quietly and hope no one else had seen it. Except, of course, that I'd already made copies and screenshots, time-stamped and ready for Phase 3. Every paranoid reaction creates more evidence. Victoria arrived at 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes later than usual. I could see the stress in her posture as she walked past my desk without her usual morning pleasantries. By 10 a.m., she'd called me into her office. "Sarah, I've been thinking about Friday night's event, and I need to understand exactly what happened with the vendor communications." She had 3 manila folders on her desk, each labeled with a different vendor name. The kind of thorough preparation that meant she'd spent her weekend building a case against me. Of course. What specific information do you need? Let's start with the timeline. Walk me through every vendor contact you made on Friday, including what was discussed and what commitments were made. For the next hour, I provided a detailed account of every phone call, every confirmation, and every arrangement I'd made. I was helpful, thorough, and completely honest about my actions. What I didn't mention was that each vendor had also received a second call later in the day, anonymous calls from someone claiming to represent a different company's event, causing just enough confusion to create the minor disasters that had plagued Victoria's party. "I see," Victoria said when I finished. "And you're certain that you didn't mention anything about payment changes or corporate restructuring to any of these vendors?" "Absolutely certain. I wouldn't have any reason to discuss financial matters, and I don't have access to that information anyway." Victoria made notes in each folder as I spoke, building her case methodically. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you accessed my computer or email accounts at any time in the past 6 months?" The question I'd been waiting for. "Victoria, I would never access your personal accounts without permission. That would be completely inappropriate. I'm not talking about personal accounts. I'm talking about work systems, my desktop computer, my email, my file directories. Only when you've specifically asked me to retrieve something for you, like when you had me print emails while you were in meetings, or when you needed me to save files while you were traveling." All true. Victoria had given me her passwords dozens of times for legitimate work purposes. She couldn't accuse me of unauthorized access without admitting that she'd been careless with her security credentials. right? Of course. Victoria closed the folders. Sarah, I think we need to have a broader conversation about your role here and your future with the company. The bus arrives. Time to step aside. I understand. Should I prepare anything for that conversation? Actually, yes. I'd like you to write a detailed report about your responsibilities, your access to company systems, and any irregularities you might have noticed in our department's operations over the past year. She wanted me to document my own firing while potentially incriminating myself in any irregularities she might need to explain away. When would you like this report completed? End of business today. And Sarah, I think it would be appropriate for you to consider this a confidential internal review, not something to be discussed with other employees. Victoria was isolating me, cutting off my potential support network before she made her move. Of course, Victoria. I'll get started right away. I spent the rest of the day writing 2 reports. The first, the one I gave to Victoria, was exactly what she expected, a comprehensive overview of my duties, my system access, and a careful accounting of any operational issues I'd observed. The second report went into my personal files and would eventually find its way to several very interested parties. Document the setup while they think they're setting you up. At 4:30 p.m., Victoria called me back into her office. She'd clearly spent the afternoon making phone calls and finalizing her strategy. Sarah, I've reviewed your report, and I appreciate your thoroughness. However, I think we need to address some serious concerns about your recent performance and judgment. What kind of concerns? Victoria opened the top folder on her desk. Let's start with the client database error that caused confusion with our Pinnacle contacts. Then we can discuss the vendor management issues from Friday's event. And finally, I think we need to talk about some irregularities in our expense reporting that seem to coincide with projects you've been managing. She was laying out her case systematically, building a narrative where every problem in our department traced back to my incompetence or misconduct. Victoria, I think there might be some misunderstanding about... Sarah, please let me finish. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of errors that have put our department's reputation at risk. More importantly, they've damaged my ability to trust your judgment and discretion. I sat quietly, letting her build her case. Every accusation she made was carefully documented in my personal files, along with evidence proving my innocence and her culpability. Now, I want to be fair to you, Victoria continued. I know you've been under a lot of pressure, and it's possible that you've simply been overwhelmed by the scope of your responsibilities. That's why I'm prepared to offer you a choice. Here it comes. You can accept a transfer to a different department. I'm thinking facilities management might be a good fit. Or you can choose to resign with a positive reference letter that focuses on your organizational skills rather than these recent difficulties. Victoria had just offered me exactly what I needed. A clear ultimatum that would force me to make a decision that would trigger phase 3 of my plan. Can I have some time to think about this? Of course. Take the weekend. We can finalize everything on Monday. The trap is set. Time to spring it. That evening, I worked late in the office, ostensibly organizing my files and preparing for my decision. What I was actually doing was accessing Victoria's computer for the final time to check whether she'd discovered the Pinnacle file I'd planted that morning. She had. The file was gone from her desktop, but I could see from her browser history that she'd spent over an hour researching corporate espionage laws and data security protocols. She'd also deleted her browser history 3 times, which suggested she was trying to cover her tracks. More importantly, she'd accessed her personal email account from her work computer, a violation of company policy to send several messages to an encrypted email service I didn't recognize. Victoria Sterling was panicking. Over the weekend, I put the finishing touches on what I'd come to think of as the Victoria Sterling Archive, a comprehensive collection of evidence documenting 3 years of fraud, theft, manipulation, and corporate misconduct. The archive included screenshots of 127 stolen presentations and campaigns, with metadata proving my authorship audio recordings of 50 meetings where Victoria took credit for my work, financial records showing $47,000 in fraudulent expense claims, email evidence of her blackmail arrangement with James Morrison, documentation of her unauthorized negotiations with Pinnacle Marketing Group, proof that she'd asked Meto alter financial records to cover up her misconduct. But the crown jewel of the archive was a detailed timeline showing how Victoria had systematically tried to frame me for her own failures, culminating in her ultimatum on Friday afternoon. Monday morning, I arrived at the office with my decision made and my plan in motion. At 9 a.m. sharp, I knocked on Victoria's office door. "Victoria, I've thought about your offer over the weekend, and I'd like to discuss the details." She looked up from her computer with the satisfied expression of someone who thought they'd won. "Of course, Sarah. Please sit down. What have you decided?" "I've decided that I'd like to explore the transfer option. But before we move forward, I think there are some things we should clarify about the issues you raised on Friday." Victoria's expression became more guarded. "What kind of clarification?" "Well, for instance, the client database error with Pinnacle. I've been reviewing my records, and I'm confident that the information I provided was accurate. If there was confusion, it might be worth having someone from IT review the data transmission to see where the discrepancy occurred." "That won't be necessary, Sarah. These things happen." "I understand, but given that you've mentioned this as part of a performance pattern, I think it would be helpful to have an objective review, to make sure we're both protected." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Protected from what? From any suggestion that there was intentional misconduct on either of our parts. I'd hate for anyone to think that either of us had provided inaccurate information deliberately. The word deliberately hung in the air between us. Victoria knew exactly what I was implying. "Sarah, I think you're overthinking this. Sometimes mistakes happen, and the important thing is learning from them and moving forward." "Absolutely. That's why I think documentation is so important. Speaking of which, I've prepared a comprehensive report about my work here over the past 3 years. For the transfer process." I placed a USB drive on her desk. "What's on here?" "Just a summary of all the projects I've worked on, the systems I've helped manage, and the various responsibilities I've handled. I thought it might be useful for whoever takes over my position." Victoria picked up the USB drive, turning it over in her hands. "This is very thorough of you, Sarah." "I learned from the best. You always said that documentation was crucial in corporate environments." "Yes, I did say that." She was staring at the USB drive now, probably wondering what it contained. "Victoria, there is one other thing I wanted to mention before we finalize the transfer." "What's that?" "I received an interesting phone call over the weekend from someone at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Apparently, they're conducting a routine inquiry into some unusual trading patterns involving Meridian Communications stock." Victoria went very still. "Trading patterns?" "Something about unusual volume in the weeks leading up to rumored acquisition talks. They wanted to know if I'd observed any irregular communications or access to confidential information within the company." This was a lie, of course. No one from the SEC had called me. But Victoria's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how guilty she felt about her Pinnacle negotiations. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I was just an assistant and wouldn't have access to that kind of information, but they seemed very interested in getting a complete picture of our department's communications and data management practices." Victoria was gripping the USB drive so tightly her knuckles were white. "Sarah, I think we should postpone this transfer discussion until after any regulatory inquiries are resolved." "Oh, I don't think that's necessary. In fact, I think now might be the perfect time for me to move to a different department." "Why?" I smiled the same predatory smile I'd learned from watching her for 3 years. "Because I think our department might be getting some very intense scrutiny over the next few weeks, and I'd hate for my transfer to be delayed by any complications." The moment of recognition. She knows she's been played. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact instant when she realized what had happened. I wasn't her victim. I was her predator. "Sarah," she said slowly, "what exactly is on this USB drive?" "I told you. A summary of my work here." "All of your work?" "Every single project, every email, every meeting, every irregularity I've observed over the past 3 years. Victoria's face had gone completely pale. And what do you plan to do with this summary? That depends. On what? On whether you'd like to revise your assessment of my performance and your recommendation for my future here. The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute. I could practically see Victoria's mind racing through options, calculating odds, trying to find a way out of the trap I'd built around her. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want, Sarah?" "I want you to call James Morrison and recommend me for the senior marketing director position that's opening up next month. That position requires an MBA and 5 years of senior level experience. Then I guess you'll need to be very persuasive about my qualifications." Victoria set the USB drive on her desk between us. "And if I don't, then I think the SEC would be very interested in the contents of this drive, along with the IRS, the Department of Labor, the HARS, and probably the journalists at Marketing Today who've been investigating corporate fraud in our industry. Checkmate." Victoria Sterling, master manipulator and corporate predator, had been outmaneuvered by her own assistant. But this wasn't the end of my revenge. This was just the beginning of her destruction. The total destruction. Victoria Sterling made her choice in less than 24 hours. Tuesday morning, I found an email in my inbox from James Morrison's office, requesting a meeting to discuss new opportunities within the marketing department. By noon, I was sitting across from the CEO of Meridian Communications, listening to him explain how Victoria had recommended me for immediate promotion to Senior Marketing Director. "She speaks very highly of your strategic thinking and your attention to detail," Morrison said, reviewing what I assumed was Victoria's glowing recommendation. "She mentioned that you've been the driving force behind several of our most successful campaigns. How generous of her to finally give me credit. Of course, she'd had no choice. I'm honored by Victoria's confidence in my abilities. She also mentioned that you'd been handling increasingly complex responsibilities and that a promotion would be appropriate recognition for your contributions." I wondered how much it had cost Victoria's pride to write that recommendation, knowing that every word was an admission of how wrong she'd been about my capabilities. When would this transition take effect? "Immediately. We're announcing your promotion Friday." Victoria suggested that a quick transition would be best for department morale. What Victoria had actually suggested, I knew, was that getting me out of her direct supervision as quickly as possible was her only chance of limiting the damage I could do to her career. She was wrong about that too. Phase 3 begins, total annihilation. My first act as Senior Marketing Director was to request a comprehensive audit of our department's operations over the past 3 years. Completely standard for someone taking over major new responsibilities. I needed to understand our processes, our client relationships, and our financial management practices. Morrison approved the audit immediately. "Excellent thinking, Sarah. It's exactly this kind of thorough approach that convinced Victoria you were ready for senior leadership." The audit would be conducted by internal consulting firms specializing in corporate efficiency and compliance. They would have access to all department files, email records, financial transactions, and employee communications. Everything Victoria had been hiding would be reviewed by professionals trained to identify irregularities, fraud, and misconduct. Victoria couldn't object to the audit without appearing obstructive or unprofessional, and she couldn't influence the results without risking exposure of even more serious crimes. All she could do was wait and hope that somehow 3 years of documented fraud and theft would escape notice by forensic accountants and compliance experts. The investigation widens. Every secret gets exposed. While the audit moved forward, I began implementing my new authority in ways that systematically dismantled Victoria's remaining power base. My first personnel decision was to restructure our client relationship management system. Instead of having all major accounts report through Victoria, I distributed client oversight among our entire senior team. This gave me direct access to client communications and project files that Victoria had previously controlled. What I found was even worse than I'd expected. Victoria hadn't just been stealing credit for my work. She'd been systematically overcharging clients for services they never received billing them for premium strategies while delivering basic campaigns, and pocketing the difference through a network of fake subcontractor invoices. The Morrison Hotels account alone showed $340,000 in fraudulent billing over 18 months. My second administrative change was to implement a new project tracking system that required detailed documentation of all work assignments, deadlines, and deliverables. Ostensibly, this was to improve our efficiency and client service. Actually, it was designed to create a paper trail that would make it impossible for Victoria to continue taking credit for other people's work or covering up her failures through manipulation and misdirection. Within 2 weeks, the new system had documented 15 instances where Victoria had claimed responsibility for projects she'd never worked on, and 7 cases where she'd blamed subordinates for failures that were clearly her fault. The beginning of the end came on a Thursday in January, when the audit team requested a private meeting with Morrison and the board of directors. I wasn't invited to that meeting, but I didn't need to be. I already knew what they'd found because I'd helped them find it. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Victoria spent those 4 hours in her office, door closed, making what I assumed were increasingly desperate phone calls to lawyers, financial advisors, and anyone else she thought might help her manage the crisis that was about to destroy her life. At 6 p.m., Morrison's assistant called Victoria's office and asked her to come upstairs for a brief discussion with senior management. Victoria walked past my desk without looking at me, but I could see the terror in her posture. She knew this was the end. The discussion lasted 45 minutes. When Victoria came back down, she walked directly to her office, gathered her personal belongings, and left the building without speaking to anyone. She never came back. The dominoes fall. Every enemy gets destroyed. The press release went out the following Monday. Meridian Communications announces the immediate resignation of Chief Marketing Officer Victoria Sterling due to personal reasons. The company is conducting a thorough review of all marketing department operations and client relationships. Senior Marketing Director Sarah Chen will assume interim leadership of the department pending a permanent appointment. What the press release didn't mention was that Victoria Sterling was facing federal charges for securities fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate espionage, or that the thorough review had uncovered evidence of criminal activity dating back to Victoria's first week at the company, or that 3 other employees had been terminated for participating in Victoria's fraudulent billing schemes. The story broke in Marketing Today 3 days later. Meridian marketing executive charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The article detailed Victoria's systematic theft of intellectual property, her fraudulent billing practices, and her attempt to sell confidential client information to competitors. It mentioned that the investigation had been triggered by detailed documentation provided by a whistleblower within the company. The article didn't name me, but everyone in the industry knew who had brought down Victoria Sterling. The final humiliation, complete professional destruction. Over the next 6 months, I watched Victoria Sterling's complete annihilation unfold across every platform that mattered. The criminal trial was covered extensively in trade publications, with each new revelation more damaging than the last. Victoria's fake MBA, her fabricated work history, her years of systematic fraud, all of it became public record. The civil lawsuits came next. Clients demanding restitution for fraudulent billing. Former employees seeking damages for workplace harassment and retaliation. Investors who'd been misled about company performance. Victoria's social media presence, once carefully curated to showcase her professional success, became a digital monument to her disgrace. Every platform suspended her accounts after they became targets for harassment from victims of her fraud. Her LinkedIn profile, which had once boasted about her innovative marketing strategies and industry leadership, simply disappeared. The final blow came 9 months after her resignation. I was attending the National Marketing Excellence Awards, the same award ceremony where Victoria had won Executive of the Year just 2 years earlier. This year, I was nominated for Rising Leader of the Year for my work in corporate transparency and ethical leadership. During the networking reception, a colleague from another firm approached me. Sarah, I have to ask, is it true about Victoria Sterling? What about her? I heard she's working at a call center in Phoenix, telemarketing for some debt consolidation company. I couldn't verify whether that was true, but it was certainly fitting. Victoria Sterling, who had spent years building her reputation as an untouchable marketing executive, had been reduced to cold calling strangers to sell financial services she didn't understand. From corner office to cubicle farm, from six-figure salary to hourly wages, from industry leader to industry pariah. The night I won the Rising Leader Award, I stood on the stage looking out at an audience of the most powerful people in marketing and advertising. Many of them had worked with Victoria. All of them knew what had happened to her. In my acceptance speech, I thanked everyone who taught me the importance of integrity, documentation, and never underestimating the people around you. The applause was thunderous. Later, at the after-party, James Morrison pulled me aside. Sarah, I have to admit something. When Victoria first recommended you for promotion, I was skeptical. I thought she might be trying to deflect attention from some performance issues in her department. What changed your mind? The audit results. When I saw the level of fraud and misconduct you'd helped uncover, I realized that Victoria hadn't been managing you. You'd been managing the entire situation. You protected our company from years of additional damage. Morrison raised his glass. To the best promotion decision I never knew I was making. We toasted, and I smiled, remembering the scared 25-year-old assistant who had cried in the bathroom after her first stolen presentation. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that in corporate America, the most dangerous person in the room is often the one nobody's paying attention to. The ultimate revenge. 18 months after Victoria Sterling's resignation, I was promoted to Chief Marketing Officer of Meridian Communications. I got her office, her salary, her parking space, her seat at the executive table. More importantly, I got her reputation, but the real version, built on actual accomplishments rather than stolen credit and manipulated relationships. Under my leadership, our department won 12 industry awards, increased client retention by 87%, and doubled our annual revenue. We were featured in Harvard Business Review as a case study in ethical leadership and corporate transparency. I was invited to speak at conferences about building authentic professional relationships and creating accountability in corporate culture. Every success was a reminder of what Victoria could have achieved if she'd chosen collaboration over competition, mentorship over manipulation, integrity over fraud. But Victoria Sterling had made her choices, and I had made mine. 6 months ago, I received a LinkedIn message from an account I didn't recognize. The profile had no photo and minimal information, but the message was clearly from Victoria. Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I've learned from my mistakes. I'm trying to rebuild my career and my reputation. I was wondering if you might be willing to provide a reference for a position I'm applying for. It would mean a lot coming from someone who knows my work. I stared at that message for a long time, remembering every humiliation, every stolen presentation, every day I'd spent believing I was powerless. Then I typed my response. Victoria, I appreciate you reaching out. Unfortunately, I can only provide references based on direct observation of someone's work performance and professional integrity. Given our history, I don't think I'm the right person to speak to your qualifications. I wish you the best in your job search. Professional, polite, devastating. I never heard from her again. The moral of the story: the assistant who was never really just an assistant. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about what happened to Victoria Sterling, if I think my revenge went too far. The answer is simple. I didn't destroy Victoria Sterling. I just documented her self-destruction and made sure the right people saw the evidence. Every crime she committed, she chose to commit. Every lie she told, she chose to tell. Every person she betrayed, she chose to betray. I didn't make her steal my work or defraud our clients or attempt corporate espionage. I just made sure she faced consequences for those choices. The real lesson isn't about revenge. It's about power. Victoria Sterling thought power came from position, manipulation, and fear. She thought that because I was her assistant, I was powerless. She was wrong. Real power comes from competence, preparation, and patience. It comes from understanding that in any organization, the person who controls the information controls everything. And it comes from recognizing that the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you underestimate them until it's too late to recover. I was never just Victoria Sterling's assistant. I was her replacement. She just didn't know it until the day she trained me well enough to take her job.